Now picture this. A rookie director is handed the reins to direct none other than Clint Eastwood, the legend. Full of confidence, he thinks he can mold Clint into the perfect character. But when he tries to control the master of cinema, he quickly learns that there's more to directing than just giving orders. What happens next will shock you. An epic clash of egos, a lesson in humility, and the ultimate redemption. Stay with us till the end because you won't want to miss how this battle of wills ends. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to stay tuned for more. Ethan Richards was on cloud nine. It was his first big break in Hollywood, and the stakes had never been higher. His heart raced with anticipation as he walked onto the set of his first major film. The excitement was contagious, and it radiated from him like a beacon. 4 months, he had been building up to this moment, pouring all his energy into his craft, confident that this was his time to prove he was ready. But it wasn't just any movie. No, this was a dream project. Ethan was about to direct Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood. The man whose mere presence in a film could make it a hit, whose performances were the stuff of legend. The man who had shaped Hollywood for decades. And here Ethan was, a rookie director with a handful of indie projects under his belt, but now suddenly standing at the helm of a big-budget film with one of the most iconic actors in history. To say he was thrilled would have been an understatement. But there was another feeling bubbling up inside him, one he couldn't quite suppress. It was the feeling of superiority, a sense that he had something special to bring to this project. After all, Clint might be a legend, but Ethan had the vision. He had the ideas that would take Clint's performance to new heights. He had been studying Clint's past roles, looking for ways to modernize the legend, add layers, bring something fresh. As he entered the set, Ethan felt a surge of confidence. The crew was busy setting up lights and cameras, but Ethan had eyes only for Clint. The actor sat calmly in a chair, reading through the script. Clint's demeanor was casual, almost detached, but it only made Ethan more determined. To him, it was a sign that Clint didn't yet know what was coming. Ethan strode up to Clint, offering a broad smile, trying to project an air of confidence that would mask the nerves gnawing at him. Clint glanced up briefly, giving him a small nod, but said nothing. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Ethan took a deep breath and launched into his director mode. "All right, Clint," he began, his voice firm but dripping with authority. "I want you to take this scene a little differently. I think it'll add more depth. Try some more expression here, a little more intensity there. Trust me, you'll see the difference." Clint's eyes narrowed slightly, his brow furrowing just a bit as if he was trying to decide whether to take Ethan seriously. His voice was calm, measured. "You sure about that?" Ethan didn't flinch. He laughed lightly, trying to mask the edge of doubt creeping into his own thoughts. "Absolutely. You'll see. Just follow my lead." Clint didn't argue. He just nodded, though his expression was unreadable, and returned to his script for a moment before he stood up. There was something in his manner that Ethan couldn't quite place. It was almost as though Clint was humoring him, letting him have his moment. As the crew started the cameras rolling, Ethan moved to his place behind the monitor, hands clasped together in front of him. His eyes stayed locked on Clint, who was now in position to perform. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment where he would prove to everyone, especially Clint, that he had the vision to direct a legend like him. And in his mind it was going to be a masterstroke. But as the scene began, there was something strange about Clint's performance. It wasn't bad, far from it, but it didn't match what Ethan had imagined. It was effortless, simple, and powerful. Clint delivered the lines with subtlety and precision, his presence commanding the room. And Ethan? Well, Ethan began to feel something he hadn't anticipated, a little doubt. But no, this was Clint Eastwood. Ethan couldn't afford to second-guess himself. He had the vision. Clint would come around. He had to. The set was quiet, save for the low hum of the crew working behind the scenes. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of exhilaration, though a small voice in the back of his mind began to whisper doubts. Was Clint really following my direction? The moment passed quickly as the rookie director snapped back to focus. He had a vision of how this film would reshape Clint Eastwood's legacy. The pressure was on, and Ethan couldn't afford to let Clint's natural talent derail it. He cleared his throat and adjusted his stance behind the monitor. He wasn't going to let the master of cinema overshadow his direction. He had to assert his control, especially in this next scene. The crew called for a reset and Clint moved back into position. Ethan rose from his seat, determined to get it right this time. "All right, Clint," Ethan said again, this time with even more conviction. "This scene is where your character starts to show real vulnerability. I want you to really dig deep to show the audience what's at stake. There's a sense of conflict here, so lean into it. Try expressing more tension in your eyes. Push harder." Clint turned slightly toward him, his expression unreadable. His voice, though, was tinged with something different. Perhaps weariness, perhaps the start of something else. "You really think I need to push harder?" Clint asked, his voice smooth, but there was a sharpness to it. Ethan felt a slight pang in his chest, but he quickly brushed it off. "Yes, exactly. The audience needs to feel your struggle. They need to see that this is the turning point for your character." He was becoming more animated now, the director inside him coming to life. "If you just play it safe, it's not going to land. You've got to take some risks." Clint studied him for a moment but said nothing. Instead, he took his position, still standing tall but visibly relaxed, waiting for the cameras to roll. Ethan's heart raced with anticipation. This time it's going to be perfect, he thought. The camera rolled and Clint began his delivery. But something was wrong. This wasn't the raw vulnerability Ethan had envisioned. It wasn't the high-intensity performance he was pushing for. Clint's delivery was understated, calm, and packed with a depth that Ethan hadn't anticipated. It was Clint being Clint, effortless, understated, and genuine. Ethan froze. He watched, transfixed, as Clint effortlessly navigated the scene, playing the moment with such quiet strength that it sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. This was the kind of performance that made Clint Eastwood an icon. But it wasn't the performance Ethan had imagined. As Clint finished the scene, he glanced over at Ethan, his gaze unwavering. Ethan felt the weight of the moment, and the words on the tip of his tongue evaporated. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. This wasn't what he wanted. "Cut," Ethan finally muttered. That's not it, Clint. Let's try again, okay? I think it needs more emotion, more intensity. Let's bring it up another level. I want to see more of the inner conflict. The stakes have to be higher." Clint didn't argue this time. He merely nodded, his expression unreadable, and took his place again. Ethan quickly moved around the set, adjusting the lighting slightly, making sure everything was perfect. "This time it's going to work. He'll see my way is the better way." The crew reset for the next take. But as Clint once again delivered his lines, his performance remained the same, subtle, powerful, and so much more than Ethan had envisioned. Clint's control of the moment was undeniable, but to Ethan, it felt like a challenge he wasn't prepared for. The rookie director's pulse quickened, and his hands began to shake slightly. "Cut." Ethan snapped again, frustration lacing his voice. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. This wasn't supposed to happen. "No, Clint. You're not getting it. You're playing it too safe. This is supposed to be a high-stakes, gut-wrenching scene. You need to show the audience what's really at risk." Clint took a deep breath, and for the first time, a flicker of something akin to impatience passed over his features. "Kid, I've been doing this a long time. I know what I'm doing. You're asking me to play it like someone I'm not." His voice was measured, calm, but there was an edge to it now. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Clint was already moving to take his seat. "If you want me to do it your way, then I'll do it. But trust me when I say you're asking for something that's not there. I've been acting longer than you've been alive." There was a silence that hung between them, thick with tension. The crew watched, awkwardly shifting their weight, but no one spoke up. Ethan stood there, feeling the weight of Clint's words sink in. His vision, the one he had so firmly believed in, was beginning to feel fragile. The rookie director wasn't used to losing control. But Clint wasn't just any actor, and this wasn't just any film. It wasn't just about power. It was about trust. And Ethan had yet to understand that. The tension in the room was thick now. Ethan stood behind the monitor, staring at the playback from the last take, but his mind wasn't focused on the scene. He couldn't stop replaying the exchange with Clint, Clint's quiet defiance, his calm yet firm words that cut deeper than any insult could. This wasn't supposed to happen, Ethan thought. He was the director. He was supposed to lead the show, not be undermined by an actor. The crew was beginning to notice the strained atmosphere. Whispers circulated. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak up. Ethan wasn't blind to the weight of their stares. He wasn't just directing a movie anymore, he was also trying to prove himself as a leader in front of everyone, especially Clint. And that weight was starting to feel unbearable. "Let's reset," Ethan called out with forced authority, his voice trembling ever so slightly. "Clint, can we try it again? Just more emotion. Please. I know you can do it. You're just holding back. We need the audience to feel this moment, really feel it." Clint gave him a long, almost dismissive look, but nodded anyway. He didn't argue. But Ethan could tell that Clint wasn't buying into his direction anymore. It was as if the actor was giving him one last chance to prove that Ethan knew what he was doing, but the more Ethan pushed, the further Clint seemed to withdraw. "All right, action." Ethan barked, a little too harshly. The camera rolled again. As Clint began the scene once more, Ethan braced himself. He watched every movement, every line, every shift in Clint's gaze. But this time something was different. Clint's performance was even more subtle, even more controlled. It wasn't the wild, raw, emotional performance that Ethan had envisioned. It was Clint. It was always Clint. The rookie director's hands were clenched into fists. His knuckles were white as he watched Clint deliver the lines with effortless grace. Clint's every word held weight, every glance was loaded with emotion, yet it was all so understated, so real. Ethan couldn't deny it. Clint's performance was 100 times better than what he had imagined. But it wasn't what he wanted. It wasn't what he'd directed. The frustration was bubbling up inside him, and it wasn't just frustration with Clint, it was with himself. His vision was crumbling in front of him, and he was powerless to stop it. "Cut. Cut." Ethan shouted, his voice sharp. No, Clint. That's not it. I need more than that. I'm telling you, you're not showing enough of the internal struggle. This isn't working." Clint didn't flinch, but he didn't smile either. He simply looked at Ethan, a small crease forming on his brow. For a moment, the room went quiet, the weight of their tension pressing down on everyone. "Kid, I've done more than you can imagine in this business," Clint said softly, but there was steel in his tone. "And I'm telling you, sometimes less is more. You're not seeing it because you're too focused on pushing it. I've been in this game for decades. I've learned to trust the moment, not force it." Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. He didn't want to back down. He couldn't back down. This was his chance to make an impact. He had to show everyone, especially Clint, that he was the one in charge here. But as Clint stood there, so calm and self-assured, something inside Ethan cracked. He felt it, a sharp, bitter pang of humiliation. "No," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, more strained. "No, Clint. You're not getting it. You're not following my direction. We're doing this my way." His words felt hollow even to him. Clint didn't respond right away. He stood still for a moment, looking at the rookie director, almost with pity. And then, without a word, he turned and walked off the set, heading towards his trailer. Ethan stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Clint just walked off set? His pride burned in his chest, but it wasn't just humiliation. It was something worse. It was fear. Fear that he had made the wrong call, fear that his inexperience had cost him everything. The crew stayed silent, unsure of what to do. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Ethan's hands trembled at his sides. The camera was still rolling, but no one seemed to know how to continue. Ethan turned to the crew, his voice barely a whisper, "Take 5. We'll reset and try again." The crew scattered, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. His mind was spinning. What did I do wrong? He had directed movies before, but none with this level of pressure. None with Clint Eastwood. As he sat in the director's chair, the weight of his actions bore down on him. He had made a blunder. A big one. He had underestimated Clint, thinking he could mold him, push him, shape him into the performance Ethan thought the movie needed. But Clint was Clint. And Ethan had just learned a painful lesson. The silence on set was deafening. Ethan sat motionless in the director's chair, staring at the empty space where Clint had just been. His mind raced as the weight of what had just happened slowly sunk in. Clint Eastwood just walked off my set. Ethan's hands were shaking now, his palms slick with sweat. He had tried to maintain control, tried to assert his vision over Clint's experience, but it was clear that in that moment, Clint had not only rejected his direction, he had humiliated him in front of the entire crew. And worse, Ethan couldn't even find the words to justify himself. The tension in the air was palpable, and it only made him feel more exposed. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to gather his thoughts. But nothing made sense anymore. What did I do wrong? He had directed films before, worked with actors who were difficult, demanding, and sometimes impossible to please. But this was different. Clint Eastwood wasn't just an actor, he was a legend. And Ethan had treated him like a novice. The crew shuffled awkwardly, casting furtive glances at one another. No one seemed to know what to do. Finally, one of the assistants approached Ethan, offering a hesitant smile. Do you want us to call Clint back in?" Ethan looked up, his eyes burning with frustration and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He wasn't even sure what he would say to Clint. Sorry? That seemed far too small, too insignificant. How could he apologize for undermining a man who had spent decades perfecting his craft, a man who had nothing left to prove? Ethan's throat tightened. His heart was hammering in his chest, and he felt a sense of panic rising up inside him. He had been so focused on his own vision, on trying to make his mark, that he had completely disregarded Clint's years of experience. He had treated Clint like a tool, something to be molded and shaped to fit his own ideas. But Clint wasn't a tool, he was an artist, someone who had earned the right to make his own choices on set. The weight of it all was suffocating. Ethan felt utterly out of his depth. He had tried to dictate a performance, but what he had learned too late was that the best performances came from trusting the actor, not controlling them. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The crew began to get restless, unsure whether to resume filming or wait for Clint to return. Ethan stood up slowly, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't know what to do. The power he had once felt on the set, the confidence that had driven him to take this project, was gone. It had been stripped away, piece by piece, as Clint had quietly dismantled his authority with every defiant glance and every rejection of his direction. Finally, Clint returned, quietly, calmly. He didn't look at Ethan at first. He didn't say a word. He just sat down in his chair, prepared to resume. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was his chance, his one chance to admit he had been wrong. To apologize. The words didn't come right away. Ethan opened his mouth, but his voice caught in his throat. He could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck. The sting of humiliation lingered in his chest. He had failed, not just as a director but as a person. He had failed to see Clint as more than a tool to carry out his own ideas. After a long, awkward silence, Clint spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. You know, kid, you can't force this kind of thing. You can't force me to act the way you want me to. I spent my life learning how to make a scene work, how to make it real. You can't direct that. Ethan flinched, the words cutting deeper than anything Clint had said before. He had known in the back of his mind that he was wrong, but hearing it so bluntly, so matter-of-factly, felt like a punch in the gut. I thought I was helping, Ethan mumbled, his voice barely audible. I thought if I could just guide you, make it different. Clint leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with a steady gaze. Kid, sometimes it's not about making it different. Sometimes it's about letting it be. Letting it breathe. You got to trust the actor, trust me. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he had been just trying to make something better, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just nodded, defeated. Clint had given him a lesson he wasn't sure he was ready for, one that would take time to fully sink in. He looked around at the crew, at the faces that were now openly watching him. He had lost their respect. They had seen him falter, seen him fail. And in that moment, Ethan felt more isolated than he ever had before. All right, Clint said finally, breaking the silence. Let's try this again. But this time I want you to trust me. No more directions, no more pushing. Just trust. Ethan nodded again, his throat tight. Clint wasn't angry, but there was something else in his eyes. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. And maybe, just maybe, that was even harder to swallow than anger. As the crew began to prepare for the next take, Ethan retreated to the shadows of the set. He couldn't bring himself to look at Clint. The lesson had been brutal, but it was the lesson he needed. The kind of humility that came from truly seeing the people around you, not as tools but as equals, each bringing their own expertise to the table. The set was quieter now, the air thick with the weight of the earlier confrontation. Ethan stood off to the side, his mind swirling with the events of the past few hours. The crew was setting up for the next take, but Ethan's heart wasn't in it. He kept replaying Clint's words in his head, trust me. It echoed through his thoughts, a reminder of the bitter lesson he'd just learned. Ethan had thought he was in control. He had convinced himself that directing was all about his vision, his ideas, his choices. But Clint had shown him just how wrong he was. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He had been trying to shape Clint, to mold him into something he wasn't, instead of letting Clint bring his own brilliance to the role. And now he was paying the price. The more Ethan reflected, the more he realized the gravity of his mistake. He wasn't just directing a film, he was collaborating with artists, and Clint was one of the greatest there was. By pushing him, trying to force him into a mold, Ethan had stripped away the very thing that made Clint so powerful as an actor. His authenticity. Ethan had let his own insecurity cloud his judgment. He was so desperate to prove himself that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. The set hummed with activity around him, but Ethan felt isolated, almost as if he were in a bubble. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Clint had walked off set. That wasn't just a rejection of his direction, it was a message. Clint had shown him the importance of trusting the actor, of letting the magic happen naturally. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about ego. It was about collaboration. As the crew set up for the next scene, Ethan wandered over to the monitors, his mind still racing. He had been trying to force the magic, trying to dictate something that was already there. The way Clint had performed, subtle, powerful, full of nuance, had been perfect. Why couldn't I see that? And then it hit him. He had been so focused on making his mark, on pushing for something grand, that he had overlooked the beauty of simplicity. Clint had done it effortlessly, the kind of performance that couldn't be planned or scripted. It was just Clint being Clint. And in that moment Ethan realized something that shook him to his core. Directing wasn't about controlling the actors. It was about trusting them. He needed to change his approach, needed to let go of his rigid vision and embrace the unpredictability of collaboration. That's what great films were made of. It was a lesson he had to learn the hard way, but a lesson that would shape his future as a director. The next take was ready to begin, and Clint was already in position, standing calmly in front of the camera. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach, but this time, it wasn't because he was nervous, it was because he knew what he had to do. He took a deep breath and walked over to Clint, who was already waiting for him, his eyes calm, expectant. "Clint," Ethan started, his voice steady but filled with humility. I want to apologize. I've been trying to force something that wasn't there. I've been trying to control your performance instead of letting it flow the way it's meant to. I should have trusted you from the start." Clint looked at him for a moment, studying him with those piercing eyes that had seen everything in the business. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, kid. I really do. But you're learning. That's what matters. Just remember, trust the process. Trust the people you're working with. You don't have to do it all yourself." Ethan felt a weight lift from his chest. Clint wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. He was simply offering a lesson about humility, collaboration, and trust. Ethan looked around at the crew who were all now watching him. The tension in the room had lifted. He wasn't just the director anymore, he was part of a team. And that was the way it was supposed to be. It was time to let go of his ego and embrace the process. As Clint prepared for the scene, Ethan returned to his position behind the camera, ready to give Clint the space he needed to perform. This time he wasn't focused on forcing a particular outcome. He wasn't concerned with making the scene perfect. Instead, he was ready to watch the magic unfold. The camera rolled and Clint began his scene. But this time something was different. Ethan wasn't watching with the same critical eye he had earlier. He wasn't analyzing every line, every gesture, every pause. Instead, he simply watched Clint, watched him perform with the kind of effortless power that only Clint Eastwood could bring. And for the first time in hours, Ethan felt at peace. The rest of the day on set passed in a completely different atmosphere. The air was lighter, the tension that had once gripped the crew now dissipating into the background. Ethan no longer felt the need to dominate every scene, every line. Instead, he focused on creating an environment where Clint and the rest of the cast could do what they did best: act. As the camera rolled again, Ethan found himself entranced by Clint's performance. The actor was everything Ethan had hoped for, but more than that, he was something Ethan hadn't fully appreciated before: natural. Clint's ability to slip into the skin of his character was effortless, and it wasn't something Ethan could mold with words or direction. It was something Clint had honed over decades of experience, something that no amount of direction could replicate. Ethan, now watching with a renewed perspective, realized just how much he had taken for granted in the past. He had once thought directing was all about asserting control, shaping everything in his image. But as he watched Clint, he understood that some things had to remain free, unspoken, untamed, and raw. It wasn't about forcing a performance. It was about trusting that the actor knew how to bring the story to life better than anyone else. After the scene wrapped, Ethan approached Clint once more, this time with a calmness he hadn't felt earlier. He could feel the weight of the lessons he had learned, and he knew he had grown as a director over the course of the day. "Clint," Ethan said, his voice steady and sincere. "I just want to thank you for your patience, and for teaching me something I needed to learn the hard way." He paused, taking a breath. "I was too focused on pushing for my own vision, trying to force something that wasn't there. But you showed me the real way to do this. To trust the process. Trust you. And trust the team." Clint looked at him for a moment, those sharp eyes studying him, before nodding slowly. "You're getting it, kid. I told you you'd learn." There was a slight smile on his face, the kind that suggested a mixture of approval and camaraderie. "But don't get too comfortable. You've still got a long road ahead of you. Just keep learning. Keep listening." Ethan smiled back, a genuine, thankful smile that reflected the shift in his mindset. I will. I promise. For the first time that day, Ethan felt like he was truly stepping into his role. He wasn't the arrogant rookie trying to impose his will. He was a director who had learned to respect the craft and the people he was working with. He felt a new sense of purpose, one that wasn't about ego or pride, but about collaboration and trust. The next few scenes flowed with ease. Clint, now fully engaged, gave a performance that left everyone on set in awe. Ethan didn't micromanage. He didn't overthink. Instead, he trusted Clint and the rest of the team to bring their best. The synergy between the director and the actors was palpable, and it was clear that something special was being created. As the day came to a close, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't experienced before. The movie was shaping up beautifully, but more than that, Ethan was starting to see the bigger picture. Directing wasn't just about making a movie, it was about creating something with others, letting everyone contribute their unique talents, and trusting that the result would be greater than anything one person could achieve on their own. The crew gathered at the end of the day, congratulating each other on the work they'd done. Ethan took a moment to stand back and observe. He watched Clint chatting with some of the crew members, laughing, enjoying the process. It wasn't just a job for Clint, it was a passion. And it was that passion that had drawn Ethan in from the start. Ethan approached Clint once again, this time without hesitation. You know, he said, I didn't realize how lucky I was to be working with you. Not just because of your talent, but because of how much you've taught me in such a short time. Clint gave him that knowing smile, a smile that held more meaning than words could convey. You'll do fine, kid. Just remember to trust. Trust the process. Trust yourself. Ethan's eyes met Clint's, and for the first time he truly understood. It wasn't about the performance. It wasn't about directing the actors. It was about guiding them, creating a space for them to shine, and trusting that the best results would come when everyone was allowed to do what they did best. As Clint turned and walked away, Ethan stood there for a moment, letting the weight of everything sink in. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt prepared to take it on. With a deeper understanding of the craft and a newfound humility, he knew he had the tools to become the kind of director who would earn respect, not through force but through trust and collaboration.